How should organizations adopt emerging technology at scale?
How do organizations justify value and return on investment?
And as we do that, what are the top technology offerings and what are we seeing in the market?
What's working and what's not?
I'm Prashant Kelkar,
And I'm Dorotea Biotech.
and welcome to our Masterclass series. We're starting a new videocast series where we're going to explore exactly these kind of questions for emerging technology trends. We're going to be starting with, of course, the flavor of the season, AI, because it's not enough to talk about AI. We need to talk about it at enterprise scale.
We've gone through the architecture, we've gone through purpose-built futures, but now we're going to be heading into something a little bit different. How are we going to be building this into something that is practical and usable for our organizations? So we are talking about the AI applications, Prashant. So not just the legacy ones, which is just computation and just transfer of data. This is taking it to a new level, something that you refer to as cognitive applications.
Exactly, Dorothea. We've spoken about the runway. We've spoken about how to get, not to build castles on sand. We spoke about cognitive infrastructure. We also said it's not about going and implementing AI, it's about how to get data, how to prepare to buy data. We spoke about transfer learning and foundational models. But all of this has to build up to something. And all of this is applications. And I think the best way to start about talking about applications is not to talk about applications but to start talking about use cases. We just finished this research study that you know about, where we started looking at two things. We started looking at industries and also the kind of use cases they're looking at. And of course, the industries was clear. It was more the information intensive industries as opposed to process intensive and asset intensive. What I mean by the three is information intensive, I would say more wealth management, capital management, financial services, media, tech, retail, CPG being process intensive, and let's say manufacturing being asset intensive. We saw most of it happen in the first bucket. Of course, information intensive, right? That of course where Gen AI would show up.
Mm.
That's what the study is thrown up, and we started looking at the use cases, and they also were in four buckets. And the first bucket which came up was no surprise. It was augmented knowledge work.
Mm.
Exactly what we were talking about in the first episode.
Mm-hmm.
What do
Correct, because knowledge requires huge amounts of data that is synthesized into something that is useful in terms of information. And then how do you apply that? Why do we have this full body of knowledge? And unfortunately, or fortunately, we have both analog that needs to get digitized, then digitized, which is being just consumed and consumed, but no one understands how to actually make sense of this. So we need people and humans, like we talked about, to start building some of this, but they can't do it to the scale that we seem to be just demanding. We're so thirsty for new ideas, new use cases. When we think about the traditional sense of librarians, they knew how to catalog everything. They knew exactly how to categorize by these particular themes. But how do you do this for the enormity of the data for the world? And then for every single vertical, for every region, and then for the future of what does that look like per generations? You can't do this alone. And that's why it's different with augmentation, because it's not saying we're not going to disband the humans. How do we work together? Like we've heard the phrases co-pilots. How can we make sure that we can build this together? The categorization, why would a human have to be doing data entry for that? Let AI or a machine be doing this, of course, with the validation of a human, but that's what the future looks like. You can then classify, this is what the computer said some of the themes are. Let me change it around. I don't agree with these things. I think that's where that augmentation use case can be there.
You're right out there. It just reminds me of my conversation last week. It was with the chief learning officer of one of the major pharma companies. And what she said was very, very curious. She used two words which I almost immediately imbibed into my new dictionary. She said the entire enterprise knowledge can be thought of in two buckets. The first bucket is tacit knowledge, So things that are documented in standard operating procedures, etc. And the second one is implicit knowledge. What people actually already know, it's just not documented yet. Okay, so she said the way to think about learning in an organization is to see how much of implicit can you convert into tacit. Because if you can convert implicit into tacit, then you've actually solved for training. And the best way to think about training, she said, is not to say training, but to call it learning instead. So she said, you got to think about how do you convert implicit knowledge to tacit knowledge, and then how do you create learning communities which actually do that. So I found that entire conversation fascinating. And I said, okay, what happens next after that conversation? That's when I bump into Aaron Levy, the CEO of Box, and they are working on what Box should do in the future. They've realized that a lot of documents, Word documents, PowerPoint, are just sitting on Box. They're wondering whether all of that knowledge, which is actually implicit in some ways because it's not in an SOP, can be brought one click up. Could you could you now use Gen AI to actually cull out what 86 documents are trying to say to create version one of an SOP? Fascinating, right? So if you start looking at how learning can happen in an organization and how actually Gen AI can take from 86 emails and documents what the start of an SOP could be, this could change everything. This could start actually what you just spoke about, augmented knowledge work.
Mm. Also, love the new job bingo we're collecting because chief learning officer. Very, very few organizations, I think, have this. They probably put training under HR, but very different view set. How can we use that data to help build this into tacit knowledge? So, really like that example.
And that also taught me, at least, that some of the first use cases we'll find are probably going to be right deep inside an enterprise. I don't know whether they'll appear on the boundary of an enterprise. So it's going to be an augmented underwriter, an augmented policy creation. So you realize my use cases are mostly insurance because that's where they seem to be coming up. So hey, I can't help that. And you start seeing that there are two things happening. The first thing is it's not directly in contact with the customer. And the second thing is AI is not being used to decide, it's being used to recommend. It recommends scenarios. So the human is always in the loop. So augmented knowledge work seems to be almost the first place where we are really seeing pilots successful at that. Which brings us to our second bucket, and that is customer experience.
A huge opportunity there because we're seeing that there was a first wave of evolution that they said the bots can take care of that. Our service desks are being bombarded with the number of phone calls and ridiculous requests internally. It was typically reset my password. I have forgotten during this period doing some basic downloads of applications versus external when we're talking about maybe some of our communications companies, even for banks again, basic requests that could be found on a website. So they thought, no problem. Like the knowledge work, we're going to download this and put it into a bot. But then customer experience sort of declined because people got angry. You can't talk to a human anymore. But there's a key to this customer experience. It's being sentient or cognitive in that case, which means it needs to be thinking more broadly and it needs to be aware of the surroundings. So you've got an angry customer. What are you going to do? How do you link it to the right human or to the right processes there? And I've mentioned this in Australia, one of the banks, Westpac, had actually introduced this lady called Wendy. Wendy's not real, but you talk to her, you interact with her, her eyes blink, her hair moves, and she will direct you to the right products and services. But she started with the understanding of the banks saw that they needed to improve the way people apply for jobs because there was a poor level of quality of people applying for jobs. They use this information to then improve customer service for themselves. So this sentient customer experience, not doing a human's job, always making sure the right products and services go to a customer agent, how does that get shifted? And then think about from a mechanic point of view, my car is broken down. How can you work together with the sentient customer experience saying, for safety reasons, make sure that you go to the local cafe, we will come pick you up. This is the little diagnostics that we're going to download directly to the mechanic as they arrive. There's lots of little things that can be done there. But I'm sure in your conversations, there's someone exciting that you've seen in this space that's pushing the boundaries.
Excitement. So you're right, definitely excitement. I'm also hearing concern.
Mm,
So that's exactly where clients seem to be most concerned about things going wrong. One
yes.
one wrong thing and it affects the brand image.
Mm,
That's why I'm seeing more caution
mm-hmm.
with excitement. So nobody's doubting that this is going to show up in customer experience. Everybody's wondering what happens to the brand image when things go wrong. So we were just on a call yesterday, redirecting what happens at uh, the handling of lost baggage with an airline. And yeah, see, there you go. A frequent flyer like me, and all of have been on the wrong side of this thing. And you can imagine how much emotion is going on that chat with a bot, right? So I'm using air quotes as I do that. So almost the first thing they were thinking of is number one, they've just realized that the entire bot experiment was just that. It was an experiment. Great, but it's backfiring. So what they're trying to do is trying to see whether through the dialogue they can actually gauge the emotion of the person. And if it's Prashant getting angrier and angrier that he's got only 3 days left in Frankfurt and then he has to fly back, and if that baggage is not arriving in time, it makes no sense, and he's getting angry, then something else steps in and brings the human in the back in the loop. So that's where I think we are seeing most caution. So number two bucket, where most of the use cases are coming, customer service, but with a lot more caution than we saw in the augmented knowledge work. Then the third and fourth bucket is, I'll be honest, Dorothea, we found ideas. We heard ideas, we found plans. We didn't really find active use cases or pilots. But we are hearing so much from the dialogues that we said it makes sense to at least track these two buckets and see what happens there over the next 3 to 4 months. And the first one was the third one there was autonomous and intuitive product creation. And there we were trying to look at how does engineering think and R&D think. Now here's the thing: I sit in New York. I was I spent 20 years in Germany. I'm in New York and I'm so far away from anything manufacturing, Dorothea. You are right in the center of it. So I'm hoping you can shed a little bit of light on how companies might be thinking on the product creation, how
Mm.
Gen can come into product creation.
So when we're thinking product, they're not looking at an entirety yet. They started building some of the components of it, and it's definitely been looked at. So I can definitely say that smart buildings and cities have been experimenting with this heavily in the last few years. Automotive is looking at this. There is an example of one of the car manufacturers that was using a little bit of augmented knowledge work, but it's a bit more that actual autonomous product creation, where they have designers of the car, data scientists, and an algorithm that is producing thousands of different variations of the design of this particular part of the car to come up with a final version of it. So they were saying it's not losing any of the creativity of the designers because they're still part of that, but instead it's putting it on steroids. They have different components saying, I would like it to be these elements here, but instead of that designer going to sleep and coming up with 10 designs, it's literally thousands of ones they can pick and choose from and saying, this is how I want to adjust it. The data scientists work with them to actually say tweaking the algorithm based on their requirements. I want it bigger, I want it smaller, other crude version, I want it to look more like a box, whatever it could be. And then with the engineers to stress test. They started bringing that design process, first of all, much shorter, but they're coming up with the most unusual ways of looking at the future, because I think there's a meme that went around on LinkedIn last year when they say when all designers go to the same school, and you see, I'm not going to say the competitors' names, of the same sedan in these different brands, luxury and maybe not so luxury between Asia and Europe, is the same. So this is
Oh my
actually
God.
taking it even further and saying the human creativity, let's expand it more places that it could have possibly have gone by showing examples, some completely wrong, but that's okay. They've been doing this with buildings too. How do we look at differences for apartments? How do we make it less box-like and more appropriate for the needs? So where does the sun direction come from? How do we simulate that? Not so that an architect, sometimes very beautifully, can draw something, but it makes no sense in that space. How do we
You're
simulate
right.
it together?
So you're saying don't just think manufacturing, Prashant. Start thinking smart buildings, luxury goods, the entire gamut of any company creating anything physical that you can touch.
Exactly. But you know what? Maybe not even physical. Because when you were talking about the information and the knowledge work, we did touch on this in one of our first episodes around music, poetry, all of these elements. Should it that happen? Well, maybe yes, if the artist chooses to use this technology to help them with them. If they choose not to, that's no problem. But ideally, that
Mhm.
they actually acknowledge, I'm using this to build this capability. So it's not always an unfair advantage.
So we have a few manufacturing clients, and what we are hearing, so if I just take the topic of AI for a second, what we're hearing from our manufacturing clients here in the US is that they are working on creating annuity services. So they're
Mm.
trying to say, okay, I want to get away from just selling things in my inventory to creating a relationship with Dorothea and
Mm.
seeing whether they can create after sales services,
Yes.
sell Dorothea a 6 year contract for XYZ, whatever XYZ is, and also start looking at how much they can control the spare parts business of the
Mhm.
manufacturer. After sales services, digital or otherwise, and after sales services in spare parts. So,
Mhm.
do you think there is an AI angle to both these things?
100%. When you were talking about the knowledge work and SOPs, it's a little bit like that, unfortunately, in the built engineering world. So there is the product specifications and the design, but then there's the operational data. Sometimes that doesn't get fed back to those specifications saying that's not performing how it was intended. Or Dorothea drives a little aggressively and she's burning through those tires a lot quicker than typical customers. So let's actually give her 2 months' notice before we have the maintenance so that she doesn't get stuck on an autobahn in Germany or wherever it may be in a highway. So, what is the tailoring of the operational experience, the after parts? How do we give her a discount if she replaces the tires earlier rather than later? That really
Hmm.
simplifies the process. And there's many different factors. You're on the road often, Prashant. So how do you streamline being in the office, working from home, working in the car, working in the plane? Imagine if there was the automated handover between all of this. It really changes it.
And all of this brings back also the hyper personalization, which everybody's been trying till now. Now, suddenly, there is things on Lego blocks or modules one could use to hyper personalize right at the moment what Dorothea wants, knowing Dorothea and how she's used the product.
Mm. But in a
That, of
non-creepy
course,
way.
in a non-creepy way. Oh my God, yeah, that's so
We'll
you.
not breach that.
Okay, yes, yellow flag, alarm bell rise in a non-creepy way. Fully agree. Fully agree. That also does inside a manufacturing firm is to take things from the field and bring that experience back into R&D. And I know the world has been talking about hill and sill, so hardware in loop and software in loop since ages. Now suddenly you have the need to do that because you have a smart product which is turned on and can give aggregates of data without being creepy, to your point, back into the loop and see what this means for the next version of the design. And this loop starts getting faster and faster, which brings us to our fourth bucket. And that fourth bucket is not to talk about the product design itself, but the actual product. Because now a smart product is actually a digital twin. You can have a digital twin of a smart product, but now you have that twin and it's a cognitive twin because it's not just detecting what Dorothea has done to it, but it's also detecting and predicting and creating what Dorothea might need in the next minute. So almost a cognitive twin as opposed to a digital twin. And when that feedback comes back into the organization, you start seeing the digital thread all the way from uh, R&D, through manufacturing, through when it's on the shop floor, and it's the factory on the field.
Mm,
Number four, do you see anything there? Because I'm not seeing anything here right at the moment
mm,
as far as AI is concerned. But are you
mhm.
seeing something there in Europe?
There is elements of that being dabbled, and I have to admit there is actually in the US, but in very specific industries. So cognitive, or even it was probably referred to as the digital twin, started with the semiconductors, the aeronautical industry to try and create these simulations. And people said this is good, we're going to try and leverage it elsewhere. The problem was there was not enough data, or there was lack of quality of that data. The integration between all of this, the data mapping was just an absolute mess. But some of these industries have achieved in a bubble this. So it could be for a locomotive engine, wonderful, but that locomotive engine running in the US, running in Asia, how does that actually be aware of its surroundings? So we know that Deutsche Bahn has actually been doing some of these things to see how the trains operate there, the mechanics of the tracks, looking at where operational failures can be, when in even some instances mice or rats have chewed across some of these cables causing signal failures. What can they detect earlier, because we don't want to have outages and poor customer service there? However, the issue really is if you want a cognitive twin and also the thread, you can't do this 100% alone, and you need to have data feeds that provide this awareness for you. So more rudimentally, guess what everyone does? Weather. But also, what about the human dynamics that interact with your either physical or digital product? And this is where it starts to get quite complicated, because how do you interpret that so it can be built into the space? So yes, automotive, definitely looking into all of these capabilities. Anything to do with mechanics, they want to have a look at that improvement so they don't always have people physically looking at this. But some of the digital products, they're starting to look at, does it work for insurance or does it work for banking? Can you imagine what does that world? What does that customer experience? What if we have that 10,000 people that default on their loans? What does that simulation, but not just a simulation, what does it look like for the banking ecosystem? So then all of a sudden it can start connecting into a whole raft of areas.
You're right. You're right. And for those who have been tracking, Munich Re just bought an IoT company. So no prizes for guessing what they have in mind to do with what my guess would be that they start managing the twins of the assets they have under their management. So who knows where this is going. So you're right. We got to probably think in terms of ecosystems, in terms of twins and threads. It's not just
Mm,
about the company itself and looking at the bomb thread going end to end. It goes more than the boundaries of the firm.
mhm.
That's when you
Exactly.
start getting into use cases which are business transforming as
Mm,
opposed to not just product transforming, right?
correct. Correct.
And we are hearing all of this, and that's why we are a little cautious at ISG. So we differentiate a lot between what we are hearing, what we are actually seeing them do, and where something is actually working at scale. And that's why we've created these four buckets. The first one being augmented knowledge work, the second one being sentient customer experience, the third one being autonomous and intuitive product creation, and the last one being twins and threads, cognitive one. And as you rightly pointed out, twins and threads should not be thought of only within an organization, but beyond the boundaries
Correct.
as an ecosystem.
Hmm.
Having said that, most of the things that we are seeing here is in the first two buckets. Are you seeing something differently in Germany or
Depend
Europe?
Depending on the industry, and we can't put Europe in a one bucket because they'll say every country and even every region in
Yeah.
the is very different, and it is in a word it is, and it is very specific around what are the challenges, what has been the biggest part of that industry for that country. In some cases, it's tourism. And originally, where I'm from in Australia, they were even doing things around simulation of some of our Asian counterparts coming into Australia and how to give them the best service. Where do they normally go to? The Sydney Opera House, the Sydney Harbour Bridge. How do we stop traffic? Or sorry, we don't stop traffic. How do we simulate better traffic control to make sure that they have a good experience that they tell back home, but also it doesn't impact the locals? So when you start looking at from all of these things, You need the data, but not you need people to interpret this properly. But how do you scale it so it makes some purpose and sense? There's been instances in Switzerland where, like in most places, people want to have their kids to go to better schools because there's certain better teachers, but that sometimes reduces the diversity of those particular schools. So they were using data to actually say, well, how do we improve the diversity without changing the borders? How do we help that without making people travel or migrate? That's great for the society there, great for schooling and education, and less disruptive for the students and teachers alike. So everywhere is slightly different, but it still goes back to what is the purpose and the goal? Do they have a KPI? Can that actually be either monetized, whether it's a revenue basis, or there's this clear value to that? And how does that get tracked over time?
This is exactly why we are doing this together, Dorothy, you and I. You're seeing something very different in Europe. I'm seeing things very different in US. It's just the nature of the markets. We tend to have a more knowledge intensive, service oriented market. You have a more manufacturing heavy market. It's just good and that we bounce these ideas off each other. And I learn every time I speak to you. And we're going to see use cases coming across all these four buckets over the next months and years. But let's take a step back and think, what are our three takeaways from
Mhm.
today's session? Why don't you go first?
The first one is that we stop thinking about applications in that legacy style that is just computation and logic based. How does it really take it to that next level around those four key buckets with sentient, cognitive, augmented, that style? How do you start mapping that within your organization?
I would add to that. And as we think about that, we're seeing that organizations start inside before they go outside, using internal use cases which are less threatening, less risky, before they start going do something on customer service. So start inside first before you go outside.
And
You have a third
while
one for us?
Yes, I do have a third one. And while it's all about innovation, thinking back to what we talked about in episode 2, the architecture, how does it fit in with all of these pieces? Because it does have to serve that technology, infrastructure, play a purpose. How does it fit into your organization?
It's so apt you bring up architecture because that's exactly our next episode. What happens to application architectures as we go? See you next time.
See you.